King Calyx once heard a man state that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. But as a king, he didn't think he had to follow the laws of others. He was wrong. Welcome to Blanket of Shadows. At first, the gods were abstract concepts, but they didn't inspire fear and loyalty the way the king had hoped. So after about a year on the island, he decided to turn humans into gods, each with a distinct purpose that sounded noble, at least in description. The god of justice would uphold the law and fairness. The god of knowledge would be the scholar of the kingdom, and the goddess of plenty would ensure longevity. But each role took a dark turn, as is the case in most power structures. The god of justice was nothing but a thug. The god of knowledge had no morality. And the goddess of plenty only guaranteed the longevity of the gods themselves, who were just instruments of corrupt King Calyx. The king's plan was to become immortal himself, but he knew that the wizard and enchantress and the island would never directly agree to such a thing. So he diverted power into the new gods in the hope that he could change the power balance. He couldn't command immortality for himself, but he could set the stage and then graciously accept it. King Calyx came down to the cottage on the beach one day and had tea with the wizards. "We're going to install the gods in official ceremonies," he began. "I've commissioned robes and crowns." The magicians knew how little raw fabric and materials were left. "But each one will need something magical," he said. "Let's start with the god of justice." The king laid his sword across the table. It had been passed down through the ages, had taken many lives. It was cleaned daily, and yet, to the wizards, it was still stained in blood. They knew the blade could be turned on them at any point. "I need this blade to do something singularly terrifying," the king had said. "Killing isn't enough?" the enchantress asked. The wizard laid a calm hand on her shoulder. The king smiled. "I'm giving up the sword," he said, which was a surprise to the magicians. "The god of justice, Thomas," the enchantress interrupted. "His name is Sir Thomas." Sir Thomas was the king's strongest guard. He was tall, fast, and since the death of his wife on the ship over, vicious. "I want this to be the sword of purity," the king said. "What does that even mean?" the wizard asked. The king leaned in. "When the blade severs a soul from this world," he said, "that soul is banished from the heaven that I and the righteous will occupy." The enchantress ran her fingers down the flat part of the blade. She could hear the screams it had caused, feel the pain it had inflicted. There was nothing pure about the blade at all. "For such a high skill, there would be a great cost," she said. The king stood from the table. "I know you think I was lying when I said that I spoke with the island," he said. "I could have made you two the gods, but the island told me that there would be 3 protectors who would defend it, and there are only 2 of you. And it hasn't spoken to me since. So you could argue that this is all for the good of the island, correct?" The magicians looked at each other. Strangely, they believed that he had talked to the island. They were in private. He wasn't making a big show. There was no reason for him to lie about that. But they didn't trust his intentions. Your tea is too sweet, the king said. Let me know when the deed is done. And he was gone. The wizards looked at the sword on the table. Many people had died by its blade. Some awful people, yes, but also many of their friends. And now, it was just sitting there. Later that night, the wizard awoke alone in the bed and wandered out onto the beach. He found his wife in the full moonlight, her feet hovering just above the ground. Her eyes were rolled back in her head, and she was speaking a language he'd never heard. Her feet gently lowered to the ground. "Who are you talking to?" the wizard asked. "The island," the enchantress answered. "And she is angry." But she was willing to listen. "We will do exactly as the king asked." The wizard was surprised, but he trusted his wife completely. And so they did. The ceremony installing the god of justice was on the edge of the cliff by the king's quarters that were still under construction. There was no shortage of rocks on the island, and the walls were nearly complete for a strong fort, along with some rooms for the king's family and other important people. Flat stones made a terrace along the edge of the cliff, giving the king a striking background for his announcements. At that point in time, the skies were clear and beautiful, not surrounded by storms like they are now. When the king handed his sword to Thomas, who was wearing a long white robe and a tall brass crown, he was no longer Sir Thomas. Feeling the king's sword in his hands, the god of justice got his first taste of magic. The king and the god both felt something electric as the sword passed hands. Something had changed. The power was real. Watching from the audience, the enchantress noticed it too, as a shock of overwhelming dread overtook her. An undeserving human was now in possession of a magical object. A strong rebalancing would follow, exactly as she told the king. The god of justice held his sword to the sky, and the crowd cheered. By installing a proxy god and feigning humility, the actions of the god of justice were seen as separate from the king. But the king had gained power through the illusion of giving it up. At dusk, Mikey began his journey. The darkness would provide some stealth. Mikey thought of Anne's story as he walked up the stone steps towards the top of the hill. The steps were made of flattish rocks and built into the earth. They hadn't been cleaned in ages and they were slick, so he had to be careful as he trudged along. He feared that if he stopped moving, the enormity of the last few days might register. He had to keep going, even if it meant a certain death. Like the subjects of the island, he, too, had abandoned his senses and started believing in the gods. There was something mystical about this place. He kept thinking of the woman in the airport and the look on her face. What if he had just followed her advice? Well, then one of the groups of men after him would have killed him, whoever they were. But that still might have been preferable. About halfway up the hill was a stout wall of stones. The thick wooden gate, made of scrapped boat parts, hung open. There were 2 skeletons on the ground, their flesh long gone. The note said that Mikey would kill the gods, so Anne was adamant that Mikey follow the instructions to a T, and that Mikey had to do it. It seemed more like a question mark than a T to Mikey, but she trusted the wizard with her life and his. Mikey stepped over the skeletons and into the fortified kingdom. At the top of the hill, he could see the stone structures in full clarity. He could also get a better appreciation for the immensity of the storm wall surrounding them. Only one structure, the largest, with a royal crest out front, had actual glass in the windows, which looked like they were stripped from the ship. This was where the important people lived, he thought. He wiped the dust from the window and peered inside to see, on a real bed, the skeleton of an adult and a child. And died, he thought. Supposedly there was a big, terrifying warrior god up here, but there were no signs of life. Everything was still. Mikey stepped slowly as he approached the flat clearing by the cliff. Pressed against one of the walls, he peered into the open area, looking for the god of justice. He saw the edge of the cliff, the stormy beyond, old stone walls. And then Mikey saw him. On the beach, Anne had described the god of justice, but then she hadn't seen him in some time, however long that had been. So her description didn't do the god of justice justice. There, sitting on a wooden chair on a small platform, was the god. Once a man, now a nightmare. His white ceremonial robe was dirty and tattered. The brass crown had been on his head for so long that it was now part of his skin. His long limbs were sinewy but still muscular. His eyes were closed, and he was attached to the wall with an aging chain. The fort was silent except for the storm. Mikey watched him for a few minutes and didn't see any sign of movement or even breathing, hoping the old man was dead. Laying in the middle of the terrace was the sword of purity, gleaming in the moonlight, stuck in the ground. Is it really a magic sword? Mikey wondered. He would soon find out just how magic it was. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the terrace, walking as lightly as he could, feeling out the stones to make sure they were solid beneath his feet. Step by step, he inched closer to the sword, keeping an eye on the dormant monster. He was within a few feet of the sword when the stone he stepped on rubbed against the one next to it, making a small crunching noise that echoed through the terrace. He froze, his heartbeat jumping. The monster never moved. After a few moments that felt like an eternity, he gathered himself and ventured on. His legs were trembling like he was walking on a tightrope. He took the last few steps gingerly, smaller distances at a time. Mikey glanced at the entrance to the terrace to gauge how far it was. It was his only way out. That or the cliff. He couldn't tell how long the chain was, or if it would hold. Knowing the history of the sword and the terrace, he didn't want to be the latest execution. Mikey grabbed the hilt of the sword. He didn't feel any magic. He attempted to free it with one arm, but the blade was stuck. He grabbed it with both hands and pulled, freeing the heavy blade from the stones. The god of justice opened his eyes. A few nights after the installation of the god of justice, there was a loud howling that awoke everyone in the kingdom. They came rushing to the terrace to find the king's young son floating in the air. There was a sickly green aura about him that kept anyone from getting too close. The king tried and tried to push through the aura to get to his son, but the force field was impenetrable. "Get the magicians!" the king yelled. The guards roused the wizard and enchantress from their sleep and marched them up the steps to the terrace. The subjects parted to give them access. The enchantress told everyone to stand back further. She smelled the air. She leaned her head back, and she listened. "Do something!" the king commanded. The wizard stepped in between the king and his wife. "You have to give her space," the wizard said. "Once she identifies the problem, we'll work together to save your son." "This is all you're doing," the king shouted. "No, it's yours," the wizard whispered. Openly defying the king was dangerous, but doing it in public was deadly. She warned you of the consequences, but you ignored her. The king reared back to strike the wizard. "Leonard the Wolfish!" The enchantress yelled. The crowd murmured in fear. The name struck fear into the king, and he let the wizard go. "How dare you speak that name in my kingdom?" the king demanded of the enchantress. She pointed at the floating boy. "His soul was taken by your sword," she said, "and now it's found you." "But how?" the king demanded. "You wanted a sword that changed the rules of the afterlife," the enchantress hissed. "When you built that wall, another one fell. He's been freed because of you." The king could hear the subjects talking. They weren't blaming the enchantress. They were blaming him. "You've got one chance to atone for your mistake," the king shouted. The enchantress lowered her head. She knew she would bear the punishment for his foolishness. "Bring the star seeds, a mortar and pestle, a candle and paper," she said. "But then there won't be any star fruits next season," the wizard protested. "There has to be another way. Without it, the children might catch the red cough." "No one has caught the red cough since we've been here," the king declared. "Because of the star fruits," the magicians said at the same time. The floating child moved over the edge of the cliff. "Do it now!" the king yelled. Soon the jar of star seeds was brought out, and the enchantress crushed the black seeds with wax from the candle to make an ink. The enchantress let her eyes roll back in her head, and she wrote 3 words in a language no one else understood, even her husband. She stood and spoke the first word, and the child floated back to her. The howling intensified, protesting and resisting her powerful magic. "Catch," she told her husband, before uttering the second word, which sounded unpronounceable to those in attendance. The wizard caught the child and handed him safely to the king as the ghostly visage of Leonard the Wolfish appeared. "I will haunt your lineage, wizard murderer," Leonard yelled. The enchantress took a deep breath and screamed the last word at the top of her lungs, breaking the aura around Leonard and dissipating him. The enchantress crumpled in a heap. The wizard ran to her side and embraced her. The subjects cheered her actions, and the king couldn't have any of it. "She saved the king's son," they shouted as the queen cradled her beloved child and sobbed tears of joy. She was a gracious queen and kind. The king did not deserve her. "God of justice," the king yelled. A weaker king needed stronger gods. Gods in the flesh. Gods to directly do his bidding in a way that he could act like he was doing their bidding. "Make her apologize," the king demanded. But sir, the god of justice stammered. The glare from the king changed his tune. The god of justice turned to the enchantress. "Do you apologize for cursing the king's son and pledge allegiance to him hereafter?" the god asked, pleading with his eyes for the enchantress to play along. Instead, she cried softly. "No," the wizard said, knowing what comes next. The guards had to hold him back. "Please," the queen pled. "Please, Calyx." "I just did what you asked," the enchantress said, and turned to her husband. "But I will apologize for leaving you so soon, my love." "Traitor," the king declared. The god of justice raised the sword like it was a weightless extension of his body. Mikey lifted the sword with both hands with great effort. He couldn't imagine how someone could swing it freely. It was so heavy, but he could manage to get it down the hill to the beach cottage. Now he just needed to get by the god of justice without waking him up. The heavy chains clanked. Mikey shot his eyes over to the chair, but the god of justice wasn't there anymore. Trying not to panic, but panicking all the same, Mikey searched the area for the god of justice and found him standing in the only exit out that didn't involve going over the cliff. He was trapped. Mikey tried to gauge just how long the chain was that was tethering the god of justice, but the logical part of his brain just wasn't functioning. He was a whiz with numbers in a calm setting, but maybe he wasn't made out for the outlaw life after all. Hi? Mikey stammered. The god of justice bared his teeth and growled. Mikey could see the helmet better now that he was out of the shadows. The brass had been on his head for so long that it was hard to tell where it ended and the god began. Just like Sir Thomas had blurred his identity with a made-up deity. The god of justice ran at Mikey, who backed up towards the edge of the cliff. The chain held the god just out of reach of Mikey, who only had a step to go until he was over the edge. The god of justice strained against it with all his might until it was clear that the chains would hold. For now. The god backed up a few steps and tried again, grasping desperately for the sword. The chains holding the god were somewhat rusted and starting to give with the intense effort. The god ran at Mikey and the chains creaked and cracked. They had one last charge in them before they snapped, and by the way the god smiled at them and then back at Mikey, he knew it. The god of justice backed up as far as he could, aimed at Mikey, and began running one last time. Knowing it was him or the sword, Mikey hurled the sword over the cliff and ducked, hoping the monster would choose the sword. The god hit the end of the chain, the weak link cracked, and the god burst through and dove over the cliff after the sword. Mikey drug himself to the edge of the cliff to take a look. The god was laying on the rocks awkwardly at the bottom of the cliff, the waves crashing against him. He sat up and caught his breath, and then peeked at the god one last time to be sure. But the god wasn't anywhere to be found. I told you to bring the sword back to me, Anne said. Yeah, you told me a lot of things, Mikey shot back. Like how the god was permanently trapped by the chains. Anne thought about it a moment. Something's changed, she said. When you showed up, the island had to recalibrate. Mikey shook his head. This is all so bizarre. And I just went along with it, he said. How do we know this is the right thing to do? Anne looked over the paper, running her fingers over the wizard's handwriting. Because the wizard would never have asked us to do it if it wasn't exactly what needed to be done, she said. This is the only remaining writing of the wizard. They would have taken this one too, if they knew it existed. Why did they take all his papers? Mikey asked. Anne folded the paper in her hands. The god of knowledge, she answered. You'll see what's left of him when you extinguish the flame he's guarding. The letter didn't say anything about a flame, Mikey said. The wizard said last and not second, Anne replied. It's how he talked. Every word mattered. Look, I can explain about the god of knowledge, but this is a hard story for me to tell and a hard task for you to undertake. Especially with the god of justice out there waiting for revenge.